asking me to be here. I've been hearing about the Lisbon Consortium for some time, and I'm really looking forward to finding out more about your work and engaging in discussions over the next day or two. One of the disadvantages of being, how should we say, an older academic is when people read out what you've done over the last 20 or 30 years, you're never sure whether to carry on or sit down and take a rest, you know. I feel kind of exhausted, and I do all of that, but it took some time, you know. But anyway, I shall carry on and give the paper. I had very little hesitation when Isabel asked me to take part in this summer school in saying yes, I'd like to, for its organising themes, the work of culture, cultural work, have long been of interest to me. They're questions that I've engaged with in the context of debates about the relations between culture and policy and the role of cultural knowledges and institutions in processes of social governance. And they're also themes that I've addressed in a work that I've just published called Making Culture Changing Society. Now, in case you think this is an unwarranted, cheap use of a presentational context for promotion, the first thing I want to say is don't buy this book. Okay? At least not now. All right? Because although I think there may be many things wrong with it, but one thing's really wrong with it at the moment is its price, because it's only published in hardback. So wait a little bit, because in October, November, if you want it, if you're interested, it's coming out in paperback at half the price. So these questions then are among the issues that I address in this new book, and which I'm still pursuing in a number of ways, including as my main topic for today, the different kinds of work that have been performed by the concept of culture as a way of life. And this work is subsequent to the work that's published in the book, although its intellectual orientations are the same, and it derives from a project that I'm involved in at the moment on the relationships between museums, anthropological fieldwork, and processes of governance in the early 20th century. And you'll see the connections as I go along. But this concept of culture as a way of life was one of the platform concepts from which the project of cultural studies was launched in Britain, in the work of Raymond Williams. But my main concerns, although I will connect with Williams from time to time, my main concern is to go back beyond Williams to see how the earlier development of this concept of culture as a way of life in early 20th century American anthropology might complicate our sense of its history and its uses. Because it has by and large been received within cultural studies as a concept ready for one, but it's got an interesting and complicated history. But before doing so, I want to outline some general principles to indicate how I think about the questions concerning the work of culture should be addressed. And I want to make just 4 points. And I can best make the first point with a quote from Bruno Latour's Reassembling the Social, where he writes that culture does not act surreptitiously behind the actor's back. This most sublime production is manufactured at specific places and institutions, be it the messy offices of the top floor of Marshall Salin's house on the Chicago campus, or the thick area files kept in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. And there are two aspects to Latour's argument here. The first is the contention that culture is the result of a work of ordering on the part of intellectual authorities. In this case, the anthropologists whom he cites. Marshall Sahlins, whose work has contributed significantly to contemporary critiques of anthropology's colonial histories, and the late 19th generation of armchair anthropologists whose work in classifying and ordering the collections of the ethnographic materials that were brought back from various colonial outposts to the Pitt Rivers Museum, a period that represented the heyday of Anglophone colonial anthropology. All right. So the work of intellectual authorities is one thing that Latour highlights. His second contention is that this work of ordering takes place in custom-built settings, an office or the archives of a museum. The argument, though, is a general one concerning the need to attend to the many different customized settings in which culture is made. The television, film or recording studio, the art gallery, archives, libraries, policy bureaus, statistical surveys of cultural tastes, for example, and to engage with the different forms of authority and expertise that are at play in such settings. Different forms of authority like art history, aesthetics, which I insist is a form of authority and not a form of anti-authority, musicology, and so on. The work of classifying, arranging, and assembling that takes place in such settings is informed by and helps to shape particular concepts of culture understood as distinctive orderings of the relations between texts, practices, and things. So I'm concerned with the ways in which concepts of culture are produced by intellectual authorities in particular settings, and with the work that those concepts of culture do through the ways in which they propose to order the relations between texts, practices, and things. Such culture concepts are, of course, highly variable, and the particular texts and practices and things that they point to may indeed be placed on different sides of the processes in which the work of culture is implicated. In some cases, culture is conceptualized as, in George Judis's immemorable words, as a resource that is to be brought to bear on changing social attitudes, beliefs, and forms of behavior, for example. This is a significant aspect of the history of aesthetic concepts of culture and its role as a civilizing agency. In other cases, and the conception of primitive culture that was fashioned in the area files of the Pitt Rivers Museum is an example of this. In other cases, culture comprises a set of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that is judged by ruling authorities as something that needs to be changed. And quite often, these two conceptions are combined as culture, in the first sense, is mobilized as a resource for transforming particular cultures in the second sense. This is indeed a significant aspect of the relations between between aesthetic and anthropological concepts of culture, as those forms of aesthetic culture associated with Western art museums, libraries, concert halls, and so on, have at various ways, at different times, been enlisted as a resource for transforming or developing the cultures or ways of life of a range of subordinate groups, the working classes and the colonized. But more of this later. The second and third principles underlying my approach to the work of culture are implicit in what I've said already, but they merit a little bit of attention in their own right. The second principle, then, is that the forms of expertise and authority that are involved in making culture, in the sense that I've defined it, and putting it to work, are to be understood as, in the Foucauldian sense, parts of specific regimes of truth. I'm concerned with cultural knowledges as regimes of truth, just like you might approach psychological knowledges or whatever, as medical knowledges, as regimes of truth. And that these regimes of truth function as parts of modern forms of governmentality. And they play a particularly important role in relation to the logics of liberal government, as Foucault defines it, and I'll come back on this. They play a particularly important role in relation to the logics of liberal government and the distribution of the forms of and capacities for freedom through which liberal forms of government operate. This is a key aspect of the work performed by culture concepts, which have, from their origins in modern aesthetics and through into the present, differentiated populations along race, class, and gendered lines in terms of the capacity to exercise the kinds of freedom that liberal forms of government require, produce, and work through. Culture often sounds a nice, fuzzy, warm concept, but it's operated for a good many parts of its history as a scythe for slicing humanity into two. Or to two or three, for differentiating humanity. My third principle is that the role played by culture concepts in these regards has to be understood not abstractly as a matter concerning solely the influence of ideas in constructing social realities, as in social constructivism, for example, but as parts of complex assemblages or dispositives in which ideas and concepts, texts and persons, tools and technologies commingle to produce complex apparatuses for the deployment of cultural knowledges, for acting on the social to bring about particular kinds of changes or transformations or dispositions in the realm of conduct. The intersections between such assemblages, libraries, media, museums, studios, art galleries, constitute, I argue, a distinctive institutional ensemble in modern societies, and it is these intersections and their relations to the social that constitute the realities that cultural analysis must engage with. And I have, as Isabel alluded to, referred to this institutional ensemble as the culture complex, with some misgivings, because I found out that subsequent to that, the culture complex had a long and complicated history in American anthropology in the 1920s. But I'll live with it. My fourth and final principle concerns how we should envisage the ways in which the work of culture that is enacted in this complex is brought to bear on the social. And I'm going to take another leaf from the work of Foucault here. In his course of lectures on the birth of biopolitics, Foucault argues that modern governmental technologies do not work on society or on the economy directly in order to bring about the changes in conduct that they seek to effect. They rather, he argues, do so indirectly through what he calls the transactional realities that are produced by the intellectual authorities, the regimes of truth, that inform the operation of such technologies. He regards civil society as one such transactional reality. It's not for Foucault something that arises from below, it's a product of regimes of authority. He regards civil society as one such transactional reality, but not a universal one. It is, he argues, a transactional reality that is specific to modern forms of government. In a similar way, then, the range of cultural knowledges, art, aesthetics, archaeology, heritage studies, anthropology, and the list could go on, that have informed the historical development of the culture complex, need to be interrogated to identify the transactional realities that they have produced and through which their work on the social is enacted. The particular transactional realities that are associated with the culture complex comprise what I propose to call, or have called in one or two publications, culture's working surfaces on the social. What are the working surfaces on the social through which the activities of culture are mediated and that are produced by the work of particular cultural institutions, technologies, and authorities? And my concern today is what are the working surfaces on the social that different concepts of culture produce? For the work performed by such culture concepts is crucial in providing the grids through which two things are brought together. First, the kinds of qualities, capacities, and affordances that are attributed to culture, the kinds of actions it is equipped to undertake. It might be reforming manners, it might be managing identities, it might be developing an economy. And the second, those aspects of the social, the particular beliefs, forms of conduct, or modes of interrelation between groups, relating to the populations on which the action of culture is to be brought to bear. These working surfaces on the social have taken a number of different forms. The conceptions of race informing the colonial use of culture as a civilizing resource is one example, through to the conception of transnational cultural hybridities informing post-multicultural conceptions of the forms of difference that cultural diversity programs should engage with. These are equally, they're profoundly different, but they are equally working surfaces on the social produced by intellectual authorities operating in the field of culture. It is, however, the concept of culture as a way of life that has provided from the early 20th century into the present perhaps the most influential working surfaces on the social through which contemporary programs of governance operating at the interfaces of culture and society have worked. And so it's to this concept that I turn. It was, of course, Raymond Williams' discussion of this concept that marked its entry into cultural studies, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this excerpt from Keywords, in which Williams distinguishes three main senses of the term. I shan't read these out, they're familiar to you, and you can look at them there. But in distinguishing these three main sentences, Williams in his keyword discussions then says that the first and third senses are closely related. And I shall then follow him in compressing these two uses into one, the aesthetic concept of culture. And I'm going to consider this aesthetic concept of culture in terms of its relations to the second sense that he identifies there, what has come to be known as the anthropological concept of culture, as defined initially by the late Victorian English anthropologist Edward Bennett Tyler in his 1871 text, Primitive Culture, and I'll come back to that. But I'm going to focus more on the concept's later career as it was subsequently elaborated in early 20th century American anthropology, initially by the founder of 20th century American anthropology, Franz Boas, but then by his successor up to and including Ruth Benedict, whose book, Patterns of Culture, Raymond Williams drew on in elaborating his concept of culture and his concept of structure of feeling. But I'm going to take as my point of entry into these concerns The 1952 survey, written by Alfred Kroeber and Clyde Kluckhohn, called Culture, a critical review of concepts and definitions. These were two of Boas's students, but it's also the book, the 1952 survey, Culture, a critical review of definitions, is the source that Raymond Williams relies on in his keywords entry on culture in summarizing the concept of culture as a way of life. And it's also a source that Williams argues against in insisting, and rightly so, on the mutual entanglement of the aesthetic and anthropological concepts of culture. This ran against the grain of Kroeber's and Kluckhohn's survey, which aimed rather to provide an account of the anthropological concept of culture that would detach that concept from its earlier humanistic and aesthetic definitions in European thought, and thus provide the basis for a purely scientific and American approach to the study of culture. And for this purpose, Kroeber and Kluckhohn interpreted Tyler's 1871 definition, and that offered by Boas some 50 years later, as what they regarded as the two milestones on the royal road to the science of culture that they wished to establish. This is Edward Bennett Tyler's definition. Culture or civilization, taken in its wide ethnographic sense, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, and so on. You'll be familiar with it. And the definition from Boas, they cite, is taken from his later works. Culture embraces all of the manifestations of social habits of a community, the reactions of the individuals as affected by the habits of the group in which he lives, and the products of human activities as determined by these habits. It's clear, though, although I can't go into details on this, it's now clear from a host of subsequent literature that Kroeber and Kluckhohn's conception of Tyler's and Boas's definitions as putatively standing free of European aesthetic traditions and tilting toward a purely scientific conception of culture forged in America will not withstand scrutiny. The history of the concept, for example, or the initial history of the concept of culture as a way of life, was deeply entangled in the histories of race and colonialism. Far from valuing all cultures equally, and this is one of the innovations that's attributed to the conception of culture as a way of life, is that unlike the aesthetic conception of culture, it values all cultures equally. Well, that might be true of some of its subsequent uses, but far from valuing all cultures equally, Tyler ranked different cultures within an evolutionary hierarchy, leading from savage to what he regarded as truly cultured or civilized ways of life. And Tyler was, moreover, quite frank in urging that it was the duty, and I quote, "the duty of civilized life, and certainly its effect, to put an end to savagery in the world, even if this meant improving savages off the face of the earth," which is, by and large, what late 19th century colonialism sought to do. Boas's position differed from Tyler's in a number of ways. It was developed as a critical response and alternative to such evolutionary conceptions of racial hierarchies. For Boas, cultures were not attached to races, and races were not definable as anatomically distinct groups, as they had been for Tyler. Boas's field studies among the Native American populations of British Columbia highlighted the distinctiveness of their ways of life as the product of particular historical processes of interaction between peoples of different origins. His anthropometric studies of America's contemporary immigrant and Afro-American populations similarly demonstrated the plasticity of their anatomical characteristics when placed in different environments. And Ruth Benedict summarized economically this aspect of Boas's legacy when she said, and this was a key break in the history of anthropological thought, culture is not a biologically transmitted complex. As well as disconnecting the concept of culture from Tyler's evolutionary racial hierarchies, Boas brought to the concept of culture as a way of life a crucial further element in contending that the traits comprising such ways of life are subjected to a particular form of organization in being brought together in a distinctively patterned whole. It's not just a kind of like a list of different elements, of different thoughts, feelings, perceptions, but which is what it was for Tyler, but for Boas, the elements the traits comprising such a way of life are subjected to a particular form of organization and being brought together in a distinctively patterned whole. And it's this notion of culture as a distinctively patterned whole that was further developed by the next generation of American anthropologists, most of whom have been Boas's PhD students: Alfred Kroeber, Clark Whistler, Robert Lowy, and Ruth Bennett, for example. And we can see the consequences of this in the definition that Kroeber and Kluckhohn offer in their 1952 summary. Again, to save time, I won't read that out, but I'll just let you feast your eyes upon it. But this notion of the distinctive patterning of elements in a way of life received its clearest and most consequential expression in the principles of what she called the configurational anthropology that Ruth Benedict outlines in her Patterns of Culture. And her chief contention here is that the essence of a culture consists in the configuration of the relations between its constituent traits. It is, she says, the result of a unique arrangement and interrelation of the parts that has been brought about by a new entity. And it's this aspect of Benedict's discussion that Williams picks up on in The Long Revolution. He says it is with the discovery of patterns of a characteristic kind that any useful analysis, useful cultural analysis begins. So while this notion of a distinctive patterning of the elements of a culture is what defines the anthropological concept, the idea of pattern that's central to this anthropological concept itself derives from the earlier history of the aesthetic conception of culture. This is this commingling of the aesthetic and the anthropological, so I want to talk about next. And it's Boas who provides the route through which this injection of an aesthetic understanding of culture into the very heart of the anthropological concept of culture takes place. As the son of a German liberal Jewish family, Boas's upbringing was deeply shaped by the post-Kantian culture of Bildung, in which the formal properties of art, literature, and music, understood as the products of those heightened forms of creativity represented by genius, provided the resources for bourgeois practices of self-cultivation, particularly in Germany, but throughout Europe and indeed America. Boas carries this conception of culture over into his studies of the cultures of Native Americans. First, in attributing the organizing patterns of such cultures to the distinctive genius of a particular people. So he collectivizes the Kantian notion of genius. And second, in also arguing that those patterns are given their most heightened expression in the work of those individuals, poets, artists, and philosophers, which, and I quote, express the reaction of the best minds in the community to the general cultural environment, end of quote. And Benedict reinforces the connection between the aesthetic and the anthropological uses when, drawing on Wilhelm Worringer's formalist aesthetics, she equates the processes through which cultures acquire that distinctive articulation of the relations between their elements that integrates them into a distinctively patterned whole to the process, and I quote again, by which a style in art comes into being and persists. Far from being contraries then, the aesthetic and the anthropological concepts of culture have commingled at different points and in different ways at different points in their history. The concept of culture as a way of life continued to be informed by aesthetic conceptions inherited from the European tradition of Bildung. And to return to my introductory remarks, this affected the kind of working surfaces on the social that the concept organized, as across the early decades of the 20th century, this concept of culture came, particularly in America, to displace the role of race, not overnight, but bit by bit, to displace the role of race in managing the relations between different peoples and populations. But the way in which it did so was somewhat surprising. As I've already indicated, the concept of culture was shaped by anthropologists in the context of their fieldwork amongst, I'm not going to focus on these, but this is Franz Boas, represented in this form as he worked amongst the Kwakiutl people of the British Columbia, and this is Ruth Benedict in her work amongst the Blackfoot. The concept of culture was originally shaped by anthropologists in the context of their fieldwork studies of Native Americans, mainly from the West Coast and the Plains Indians. For it was only in such areas, in contrast to the early history of the colonization of the eastern seaboard, that, quote, primitive cultures were still believed to exist in a relatively pure state. Their study was, as this was the case worldwide, was therefore to be conducted as part of a project of salvage anthropology, committed to documenting the ways of life of such primitive cultures before their inevitable disappearance before the unstoppable march of Western civilization. But, and this is the point I'm interested in, there was little sense that the findings of these studies should serve a practical purpose in guiding the policies that would shape the relations between mainstream America and Native Americans. The reasons for this are complicated, but include the consideration that such problems, it was thought, might simply go away as a consequence of the eventual disappearance of Native Americans under the onslaught of a superior civilization or through intermarriage. And this was true in conceptions of primitive cultures in Australia at the same time. Yet, and this is the point I'm interested in, the concept of culture that was developed in these contexts was seen as providing the means of managing the newly developing problems of an America that was rapidly becoming multicultural. This was an America, though, that was largely focused on the East Coast, where large-scale immigration from Europe, the East Coast, not the West, okay? So this is kind of like another version of anthropology at home, and the study of what happens on the West, its lessons are applied at home on the East. This was an America, though, that was largely focused on the East Coast, where large-scale immigration from Europe and the massive movement of Afro-Americans from the southern states to the north after the Civil War produced a commingling of different peoples on a scale not hitherto seen in America, and where the indigenous population, what was referred to as the indigenous population, meant Anglo and North European migrants from preceding generations. A good example of this split or dissociation between the concept's genesis in one intercultural context on the West Coast and its practical application in another context on the East Coast is provided by Boas's book, The Mind of Primitive Man. Published in 1911, this surveys the evidence about primitive peoples that have been produced in different national traditions of anthropology to that point in time, mainly American, German, French, and British traditions in anthropology, all of which have been committed to the study of colonized people, whether in the form of the settler colonialisms represented by the USA, Canada, and Australia, or the overseas colonies of France and Britain. All of his examples come from over there, come from those contexts. But when in his final chapter, Boas asks what these findings have to contribute to the governance of race problems in the United States, he immediately discounts Native Americans as being of any significance whatsoever from this point of view. Their scant and dwindling numbers, he says, and the slight history of their intermarriage with Americans of European origins means, he says, that they constitute too insignificant an element in the American population to merit any such attention. Instead, he immediately looks to the influx of African Americans and of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Asia and North Africa, and the interfaces between these and the earlier generations of settlers who came from Northern and Western Europe as, to borrow from James Clifford, the contact zones to which the lessons of anthropology at that point in time should be applied. And there were in the main two such lessons, both deriving, albeit in different ways, from the relativizing orientation of the culture concept. The first consisted in its implications for managing diversity through programs of assimilation. This depended on the ways in which the culture concept critiqued evolutionary racial hierarchies and asserted the parity of different cultures in demonstrating that all cultures cohered around historically determined and therefore mutable organizing principles. It was these principles constituting the distinctive genius of a people that accounted for the integrity of cultures of ways of different cultures of different peoples as distinctively patterned wholes. And assimilationist programs, it was argued, would benefit from an understanding of the difficulties involved in progressively unraveling migrants from their immersion in those cultures that they brought with them. It's a kind of an understanding of the ways in which culture constitutes a patterned whole that gives new forms of social governance by new forms of authority, or ways of managing assimilationist programs by thinking about the migrant as someone who might be unraveled a little bit from the distinctively patterned whole of the culture that they bring with them and raveled into the culture of the mainstream society. Melville Herskovits and Malcolm Willey, two of Bowes' followers, put the point in as follows in 1923. The immigrant who comes to this country is acculturated, to a different pattern from the one he finds here. And the process of becoming an American is a bewildering one. If those who insist on registration laws and 4th of July orations as measures of Americanization were more conversant with the workings of the culture pattern and the relations of the individual to it, there might be more efficiency and less heartburning in this process. The concepts of good and bad which we apply in cultural judgments fade before the broadness of vision, which is consequent upon an application of the workings of the cultural pattern. Comprehension that cultural patterns arise through historical processes, that they are unconscious in their development and capricious in the extreme, is essential to the one who would undertake the difficult problem of social control or amelioration. And of course, the one who would do that here is the anthropologist. The second lesson, derived from the culture concept for the working surfaces on the social of this period in American history, depended on the use of other cultures, the other cultures in this case of so-called primitive peoples, as a device for defamiliarizing our own cultures and our relations to them. All of the early American anthropologists in the 1910s and 20s and so on were around at the same time of a critical moment in the development of modernist aesthetics, in which the aesthetic was held to be a defamiliarizing mode of knowledge. Okay, and there's clear connections with how they translated this aspect, a different interpretation of the aesthetic into their concept of culture. Ruth Benedict takes this tack in her book Patterns of Culture. While arguing that the evidence of anthropology had by then disproved that there was any essential distinction between, and I quote her, between ourselves and the primitive, these are kind of texts in which there's never any essential distinction between ourselves and the primitive, but nonetheless the language remains in place, and it still holds certain operative distinction. While there's no essential distinction between ourselves and the primitive, she maintains that primitive cultures can still serve a useful purpose if they're thought of as laboratories for studying processes of cultural formation. As cultures which have been shaped through histories that have had little contact with our own, she argues, primitive cultures afford a point of critical contrast from which we might gain an insight into the particularity of our own cultural values, and in the process identify qualities that we might want to call into question in ourselves and from which we might want to unpick ourselves. This was a conception in which modernist science and modernist aesthetics combined in a conception of the indigenous other as a defamiliarizing device that might be used to bring the cultures of mainstream America under the microscope for mainstream Americans themselves, to provide a new practice for the Reformation, a new set of resources for reforming and transforming the self. This would, it was argued, provide liberal Americans with a resource for practices of aesthetic self-fashioning that would take their cue from the insights into the self acquired from anthropology's lessons of comparative cultural difference. The persons whom I quoted here, Herskovits and Wiley, again. It's not surprising then that the sociologist immersed in the culture of his own group should have missed quite completely the importance of that culture itself as the element by which he might explain the problems which puzzled him. It is perhaps one of the most confusing characteristics of culture that we are quite unconscious of it, almost as much so as we are of the air we breathe. We've been born into it and our responses have been completely conditioned by it. It's only when we consider cultures as different from our own as those of primitive people that we begin to see the working of culture. Okay. These conceptions, to move toward wrapping this part of my presentation up, had a significant influence on American liberal political thought. John Dewey, for example, in his 1939 text, Freedom and Culture, said, and I quote, that it's only through the medium of culture that science could aspire to shape human desires and purposes. Only through the medium of culture that science could aspire to shape human desires and purposes. In demonstrating the extent to which human patterns of thought and behavior were the product of different cultures, he argued, anthropology required that the founding assumptions of liberal political thought should be reconsidered. The individual, Dewey says, does not pre-exist society as the subject of freedoms derived from nature. Rather, the individual is the highly plastic and malleable product of different cultures. This being so, it falls to anthropology, which is the science that Boas had in mind, the science that Dewey had in mind. The reason for my slip there is that Dewey and Boas worked together for quite an extended period at the University of Columbia in New York. This being so, the fact that the individual is the highly plastic and malleable product of different cultures means that it falls to anthropology to show how different cultures produce different forms of individuality. In discharging this task, anthropology was to accord pride of place in directing the passions, desires, and interests not of raw individuals, but of individuals as members of different groups that would respect the freedom and autonomy of their members. The quote from Dewey: "The fact which is decisive in answering the question whether verified knowledge is or is not capable of shaping desires and ends as well as means is whether the desires that are effective in settling the course of action are innate or fixed or are themselves the product of a certain culture. If the latter is the case, the practical issue reduces itself to this: is it possible for the scientific attitude to become such a weighty and widespread constituent of culture that through the medium of culture it may shape human desires and purposes? The issue ceases to be the indeterminate one of the relation of knowledge and desires in the native psychological constitution of man. It becomes the determinate one of the institution of the kind of culture in which scientific method and scientific conclusions are integrally incorporated." We see here in this concept of culture a new object in the field of knowledge. It's really important to say that. It's a new object in the field of knowledge. It's a new object in the realm of governance. For we can see here then how this concept of culture in the tradition of American anthropology, this concept of culture as a way of life was thought of as a key component in an institutional program of intervention into what was in effect a new zone of action. Culture understood as a set of forces of ideas, beliefs, and customs that displace the conception of the individual as a source of pre-given innate capacities. And we can also in this light see the importance that these anthropologists invested in securing the status of anthropology as an autonomous science with its own object, culture. For it is only if it can act as what Dewey calls a verified knowledge, from that quote, it's only if it can act as what Dewey calls a verified knowledge that anthropology could become an active component in those institutional arrangements through which the desires and ends of social action might be shaped. This entailed a constant and ongoing endeavor in the early 20th century to separate the domain of culture from the claims to knowledge and authority of other sciences. In particular, it was pitched against the authority of psychology in rebutting its individualist premises. It was also pitched against the authority of biology in rebutting or limiting the extent to which appeals to hereditary mechanisms might account for differences in conduct and capacities exhibited by different peoples. These definitional struggles at the level of theory were accompanied by a series of complex histories in which the culture concept was put to work, sometimes by itself, sometimes in collaboration with other disciplines, particularly sociology, in governmental programs that were aimed at changing the conduct of specific populations. Such programs invoke the authority of the anthropologist, whose knowledge of the specific patterning of a culture provided in that pattern the transactional reality, the working surface on the social, through which governmental activity, not necessarily of the state, this might be of voluntary organizations or whatever, might be brought to bear on the population in question. As such, they were usually guided by that concern identified by Dewey to provide a means for governing that would respect the freedom and autonomy of the governed, to the extent that governing via culture provided an indirect means of governing that dispensed with the need for directive forms of rule. I think this is crucial to the role that the concept of culture comes to play in processes of liberal governance, to the extent that the concept of culture provides a means of intervening in the conduct of conduct that displaces the need to intervene directly. This was the case, for example, with Margaret Mead's work, another of Boas's students and successors, alongside the psychologist Kurt Lewin, her work in devising strategies for changing attitudes to the consumption of offal in wartime America. For they approach this as a question of removing the barriers, the cultural barriers to consuming offal, and doing so indirectly by seeking to change the value of shoppers, mainly women, rather than sanctioning the idea of state-directed propaganda campaigns, because that would have been too much like what the other side was doing in the context of the war with Germany. Yet the applications of the culture concept were rarely entirely freed from the evaluative assumptions of the earlier aesthetic concept of culture it had been pitched against. The reverberations of the Kantian conception of culture, in which the capacity for free forms of human agency is linked to a capacity for self-reflection, are clearly audible in this tradition. Let me just unwrap what I said about Kant there. Perhaps the most distinctive and enduring influence of Kant's conception of culture was his conception that it defined a realm of free human agency that distinguished the human from the animal, but at the same time, the Kantian conception of culture always provided a means for distinguishing some humans from others. Some humans were more human than other humans in terms of their capacity to exercise this attribute of freedom. And we can see the legacy of this in the contrast that Clark Whistler makes, another of Boas's descendants, in his 1923 text Man and Culture, in the contrast between modern and primitive cultures. So in our culture, few phases of life have escaped the thinker, and the increasing momentum of accumulation is now carrying us along with startling rapidity, so that religion, marriage, and even the most intimate affairs of life are bared to this penetrating light. Here lies the significance of the term primitive, for those cultures are primitive in which rationalization is weakest. They are slackers in culture who have slumped back into the byways of isolation. They have not stood still insofar as the content of their cultures go. It may be doubted if culture is ever truly static, but in the manner of rationalization, they are on the chronological level of past ages. Imagine being slackers in culture. These disciplinary struggles over the concept of culture were brought to some kind of closure in 1958 when Alfred Kroeber, then the leading spokesman of American anthropology, and Talcott Parsons, the doyen of American sociology, published a jointly authored paper in the American Sociological Review in which they agreed on a division of labor between the concepts of culture and society. Disposing of the claims of biology and psychology, at least to their own satisfaction, they argue that all aspects of human behavior are socio-cultural. And intriguingly, socio-cultural with the L in the middle. We talk these days about the socio-cultural with a hyphen there, but they talked about the socio-cultural. Insisting that all aspects of human behavior are socio-cultural with both societal and cultural aspects at the same time. It would therefore, they said, make for greater analytical precision if anthropology and sociology were to agree how to define their different approaches to this shared territory. And they proposed for this purpose a narrower use of culture that had hitherto been the case in American anthropology, restricting its reference to transmitted and created content and patterns of values and ideas and other symbolic, meaningful systems as factors in the shaping of human behavior and the artifacts produced through behavior, defining society or the social system as the specifically relational system of interaction among individuals and collectives. Our focus on this article was 1958 was the same year in which Williams, for the first time, very briefly referred to the concept of culture as a way of life in the introduction to his book, Culture and Society, although he refers to it there without referring to the American tradition. He only refers to this 3 years later in The Long Revolution. But this was not, though, either the beginning or the end of the influence, or the only aspect to the influence of the culture concept that had been developed in America had on ways of thinking about or engaging with culture in the British context, which I'm going to briefly conclude with. It had the American concept of culture as a way of life, as a distinctively patterned whole, had an influence on T.S. Eliot, an influence that was probably derived from Robert Lowy, another of Boas's students, who provided a listing of American culture in his 1917 text, Culture and Ethnology, which, at least for white America, aptly summarized the democratic and inclusive orientation of the concept of culture as a way of life. The fact that your boy plays button, button, who has the button? I don't know what button, button, who has the button is, but it sounds a good name, good game. The fact that your boy plays button, button, who has the button is just as much an element of our culture as the fact that a room is lighted by electricity. So is the baseball enthusiasm of our grown-up population. So are moving picture shows, thé de séance, Thanksgiving Day, masquerades, bar rooms, Siegfried midnight follies, evening schools, the Hearst papers, women's suffrage clubs, the single tax movement, Riker drugstores, touring sedans, and Tammany Hall. T.S. Eliot, in his 1948 text, notes on the definition of culture strikes a similar chord, and I think it's likely that he'd read this definition from Eliot, although I don't know that. Strikes a similar chord, albeit evoking a more ruralized conception of a British national culture whose different elements are brought into a harmonious relationship to one another, that distinctively patterned whole again, in being subordinated to the key elements of English ruling class culture. Culture, he says, includes all the characteristics, activities and interests of a people. Derby Day, Henley Regatta, rowing, cows, sailing, all of these are upper class sports. The 12th of August, hunting partridges. The dog races, the pin table, those are more popular. The dartboard, Wednesday cheese, boiled cabbage, cut into sections, beetroot in vinegar, but brought back again to traditional sort of like English ruling class notions of culture, 19th century Gothic churches and the music of Elgar. Williams, of course, gave the concept of culture a more democratic inflection in his interpretation of culture as a way of life, seeing in it, in line with its American usage, a means of valorizing working class culture and experience, and of attaching this to the historical project of creating a common culture that would transcend class differences. And the concept was given a different interpretation, or a different inflection, I should say, yet again, by the Birmingham School, when particularly in the book Resistance Through Rituals, written by Stuart Hall and his colleagues, a book in which the study of urban subcultures that had grown out of the American tradition was brought into contact with the principles of Althusserian Marxism. What changes in the work performed by the concept of culture as a way of life were associated with its adaptations in the formative vocabularies of cultural studies? Well, this is not a question I can answer today. You'll have to ask me back next year if you want me to answer that. But my discussion of the earlier history of the concept points to the directions in which I think we should begin to look to an answer. And we should look to an answer to the ways of assembling, classifying and ordering the relations between texts, things and peoples that were proposed by the early champions of cultural studies. And we should relate these to the institutional contexts in which they did their work. And we should think about the new forms of authority that cultural studies sought to produce and exercise. And we should think about the kinds of transactional realities, the working surfaces on the social, through which these authorities sought to act on so as to change and direct ways of thinking, feeling, and acting in society. These, I think, are some of the things that would be needed for a critical, rather than purely celebratory account of the ways in which the concept of a culture as a way of life informs our work in the present.